Hello, you're watching The Hermetic Hipster, and this is my guide to the Technocracy, a supplement for Mage the Ascension. This is my first look at the older books published about the world of darkness, and I wasn't sure which one would be a good first choice. I thought about doing a vampire book, as this is the flagship product and might have had a wider appeal, especially after the release of 5th edition. But in the end, I chose to look at a book that I not only think is one of the more well-made and interesting books, but also a personal favourite, The Guide to the Technocracy. If people like this video, however, I thought it might be fun to do other books in a similar style, and if you want a particular book looked at, maybe about your favourite faction, ask me and I might be able to see if I can get my hands on it. For those unaware of who the Technocracy are, maybe you're new to Mage or new to the world of darkness in general, I'd recommend buying the core book Mage the 20th Anniversary Edition, as it gives a very broad overview and will put this video in a good context for you. However, although this is technically a book review, I do intend for it to be informative about the faction and the lore surrounding it. I just felt by looking directly at their supplement, I could talk about them with more focus and greater depth and with a bit more structure. If you're totally new to Mage, however, I will give a brief overview of what the Technocracy is. The Technocratic Union is an organisation of mages in the world of darkness game Mage the Ascension. They are defined by their use of technology, often highly advanced, and their desire to stamp out all things they consider supernatural. To hear them tell it, they are responsible for the modern world and its technological marvels, and their stated mission is the betterment of humanity and its protection from the predatory things that lurk in the shadows of the world of darkness. How they do this, however, is not as noble as the goal might imply, often using mind control, assassination, social control, and mass surveillance to achieve their ends. Their trope is the all-seeing, all-powerful, authoritative organisation, drawing from things like Big Brother in 1984 and myths of the Illuminati. Their agents are faceless suits, corporate company men and killer androids, and amoral scientists and inventors. In Mage, they are one of the main antagonists, seeking to destroy wonder and mystery from the world, and crushing anything that does not conform to their rigid ideals. That was until this book was published. The Guide to the Technocracy came out in 1999, a full 6 years after the Mage the Ascension was first released, and is part of the Year of Reckoning product line. It was written by Phil Briccato, the mind behind Mage, Brian Campbell, Steve Long, Tom DeMeo, Scott Taylor, and Christine Gregory, with the art being directed by Eileen Miles. Interestingly, it is the first Mage book to use the word magic when referencing to sphere magic to use a C and not a K. And although some thought this was because it was about, and is often from the viewpoint of, the Technocrats, this trend stuck, and when Mage the Ascension Revised Edition came out next year, the K was dropped entirely. It may be a simple design choice, but I like to think the Union's abilities to enforce consensus and more normality had some part to play in dropping this more specialised spelling. This is the first major publication to present the Technocratic Union as, if not always sympathetic, then purposefully as potential protagonists. The second header in the book sums up the theme perfectly, styling itself as a guide to the good guys. The following paragraphs are self-referential in their intention, telling the reader how stories of killer drones, mind slavery, and bioplagues are all lies, at least for the most part. Speaking of in-game tradition stereotypes of the Union, but also the background provided on them so far in other Mage supplements. The opening section goes on to do a great job of presenting the Technocracy as unlikely heroes, its agents and scientists being the only thing standing between humanity and the horrors of the world of darkness. The Technocrats' aims are explained, and its motives given, and it does a great job of refreshing what was an old and familiar theme for many Mage players, without rewriting their old image, and without changing the Union's background. It simply presents them in a new light, allowing the reader to reimagine long-established villains as much more complex and nuanced, making you step back and say, yeah, if it was me in the world of killer Garu, mind-controlling vampires, and reality-warping mages, I would be glad that there's someone out there fighting for the mundane person. And that's exactly how this book takes the Union from being archetypal villains to actually likeable protagonists, because they don't need some cosmic cause like the Garu, the lashings of denial of the kindred, or the selfish anachronism of the traditions to justify the morality. They say, hey, you like 3 square meals a day, affordable medicine, holidays abroad, Facebook and central heating? You like coming home from your job that's not slavery or serfdom, eating food you didn't have to grow yourself, and watching TV with your spouse while the kids do their homework, without being worried where your next meal is going to come from, or if violent monsters are going to break down your door. That's us, and you're welcome. Although the introduction is wonderful at refreshing the Union's image, this section has two other useful parts. The first about themes of running in a Union game, and the second about how to use the book itself. The themes are interesting, giving a new look at an old face yet again, and presenting the Technocracy as still a monolithic ivory tower, but this time one under siege, giving example of Union's failings and disasters that take away the seeming invincibility of the Technocrats that many Mage players will be familiar with. The conventions are always mentioned as not being a unified force, but instead rife with infighting and petty politicking. This again gives the Union a feel of imperfection and humanity rather than faceless robotic oppressors, and therefore being much more appealing to be played. It also highlights the changes from the order of reason, the Union predecessors, and then move from enlightened idealism to the more pragmatic ideal of the sinister greater good mentality that the Union possesses in the modern knights. The how to use this book section brings to the fore in the first paragraph one of my favourite things about how this book is written, the sardonic humour. It rips into the original Mage concept by saying, "Welcome back to reality, you now own a different game." Long ago, in the original version of Mage the Ascension, you, the storyteller, would hand out the rulebook and let everyone in your group dream of the most bizarre and mystic things they could imagine. One player might request a necromancer, another would want a mad scientist to build a rocket ship in a secret laboratory, and a third would brag about his mage's proficiency with psychedelic drugs and heavy weaponry. For some reason, they'd all live in the same house, just like on MTV, hiding from the reality police. Fortunately, each of them had exotic ideas about ascension and escape, of course. Not only does this show the pragmatic realism of the Union, but it also tells you about the kind of game you're about to play with this book. It's effortlessly cool in the way that's in stark contrast to many of the earlier books from the 90s that seem a bit aged. There's a short story told before this whole introduction section, but I feel without reading the whole thing out, I would only be giving spoilers to a pretty cool fluff piece. But I do recommend reading it, as it gives a bottom look up on what it might be like to be a Union agent. The next section of this book is entitled Indoctrination, and is introed with a far more typical fluff story about the Union, one where a subject is being mind-wiped and tortured in the infamous Room 101. The main section then goes on to directly reference this fluff piece, saying that this is the view of the Technocracy as always bad, traditions always good, and how that is far too simple. While it does repeat itself a bit, I think the point is worth reinforcing, as this section goes into much more detail about why the Union are like they are. It goes on to critique the Union party line about the Union, and gives an explanation to the philosophies behind the Technocracy. What it does not do is present the Union as goodies, rather pointing out the traditions aren't much better than they are, and that with all the monsters and freakish horrors of the world of darkness, the Union has to make some morally compromised choices in its efforts to stop them. It also points out the corruption within the Union, and the opposing agendas of the conventions, again presenting a Technocracy much more complex than had previously existed. Also in this section are listed some of the secret societies within the Union, giving options for storytellers to give a much more nuanced option than even the conventions present. My personal favourite of these are the Friends of Courage, a loose group of idealists made up of all parts of the Union, who secretly assist the legendary rogue agent John Courage. Secret Agent Courage is mentioned in several other books, including M20 and How Do You Do That, and personally I love the idea of technocratic fangirls and boys helping him out of scrapes, and swooning when he gives them a "thanks kid" before disappearing back into legend. After this there is a lexicon, giving a rundown of various technocratic terms, as well as defining and deciphering some of the technobabble you will find in this book. At first it seems a bit bland, if useful, but as you read it you see various Union slang and colloquialisms that give much more personality in the scut talk section, although terms of romantic feelings towards a clone being dubbed banging a bar, referencing sheeps being a famous cloning experiment, is hilarious as it is disturbing. Chapter 2 is called Enlightened Science, and it's here we get into the workings of how the Union's awakened agents do their magic. It's a little wordy, but the basics are belief in a rational worldview, practice of knowledge in scientific disciplines, and using instruments to apply this knowledge. An appropriate analogy, I feel, is Archimedes' lever and fulcrum. The greater your genius, or your arete, the more you can manipulate reality. Here we also get an overview of how the Union rejects the ideas of magic and will working, believing there is no such thing outside of the scientific consensus. We see here the strength and the weaknesses of the Technocratic paradigm. One grand unifying theory of reality based on the laws of nature gives a lot of scope, and goes a long way to explaining the universe, but is fundamentally flawed. The Technocracy and other mages do alter reality, and a certain level of denial have crept in to the Union's practices as they won't admit this, even to themselves. The other obvious strength of their paradigm is that most closely linked to the current Earth consensus, meaning many of their effects are not vulgar. Even some of their flashier effects could be explained away as advanced science, giving them an edge when it comes to the ease of using magic, as well as a slower accumulation of paradox. As their paradigm is fundamentally based on knowledge, as long as it is not applied in an overtly consensus-breaking manner, then they are all good. Indeed, personally the most appealing technomantic magi for me are those who exist entirely within the realms of the consensus, simply appearing infinitely talented, knowledgeable and well-connected. Unsurprisingly, this is why my favourite faction is the Syndicate, who we will look at a bit more in the later part of this video. This section does, however, talk about what happens when Technocrats do accumulate paradox and have backlashes though. Instead of spirits appearing to punish them, or an arm turning into rice pudding, their gear will malfunction, laser guns will explode, and in the case of their grand achievements of social engineering, countercultures challenge the status quo. Personally, I like backlashes being appropriate for the paradigm in effect, but here even more so, with the Union's hubris and arrogance at their superiority coming back to punish them. I like to think of certain effects you could easily play out as literary staples, with the idea of the creation destroying the creator, and it inspires me to think of more interesting backlashes effect for my games, things like that of Mr. Hyde, Frankenstein and The Fly, or even the Planet of the Apes, as just being very high level paradox backlashes. Some depth has also gone into on how the Union explains things like avatar and quintessence, usually rebanding them with simple scientific terms, as well as explanations of the spheres in terms of their own paradigm. In this book there is no mention of the data sphere or primal utility, those being created later, but the spirit sphere is replaced by dimensional science, although much more similar to spirit than what we see in later versions, being more of a rebranding than true alternative. The Enlightened Science section is a good read, giving a mostly concise overview of an easy to understand and connect paradigm. I'm a big fan of the cause and effect on display and in described practices, as I believe all mage paradigms should have a strong internal logic, and I would recommend using this as an example paradigm for new mage players on how paradigms should work. Chapter 3 is about the history of the Union, from the early will workers who showed signs of the first rational philosophies, to the formation of the Order of Reason and eventually the Technocratic Union. The early history looks are at China, Greece, Rome and Egypt, and is reasonably interesting. Personally, I would have liked this section to be larger and looked at other early examples of technomantic roots, such as Phoenician language, Indian cartography and cosmology, and Ethiopian Axum, but I understand they could not include everything. It does, however, feel a little Eurocentric, with only the section on China being outside of traditional Western history. There is also a section describing conspiracies in early Egypt and the cult of Thothemes, as well as examples of early magi. But for me this falls short. I wish this section could have been used to give more inspiring examples of science and reason being used around the world, backing up the assertion that reason and science are universal and inevitable. Another section in this chapter I dislike is this section about Avalon being a technomantic ideal. For me, there are much more interesting examples in history that could have been held up as a golden age or mythical ideal for the technocracy, such as the Mediterranean under Pax Romana, a multitude of Persian dynasties, or the Chinese Qin dynasty. While I see the irony of Union agents idealizing a literal myth, I think these examples of ancient empires that brought unification and centralization and the advances of civilization as a more interesting ideal for the technocracy. The histories of the Order of Reason and the Union are best off being read for yourself. Personally, I'm not overly a fan of the beat-for-beat meta-plot histories, and when I do read them it's usually last. It's ultimately just a story, and not a very personal one, and I have difficulty connecting to events and factions in this way. However, there is an interesting underlying narrative to this mid-section about the Order's history and the gradual decline of the idealistic craft masons and the rise of the pragmatic and materialistic High Guild, and that is a good representation of the change of the Order of Reason and the Technocracy. One thing that never made sense to me was that it states there was some kind of agreement between magi, notably of the Order of Hermes, and the common man, where the mages watched over the common folk and protected them, and the common folk provided to their basic needs. To me, this seems a bit too fanciful, and I always took it with a grain of salt and write it off as Union propaganda. The later history gives details of the Order's rise to power and self-purge and the formation of a technocratic union, with the newly added failings and disasters that have overtaken them and pushed them to the limit. The creation of the Union and their history in the 19th and 20th century is very Eurocentric, but I have less issues with this than the earlier history. The Union at this point is highly linked to the liberal Europe and imperialism, pushing an agenda of one world government. Personally, I feel that this could not be the writing being Eurocentric, but rather the faction being Eurocentric in the background, and I feel it serves as an end point for the Union's descent from idealists to brutal oppressors. They use the evils of empire and cultural oppression through economics and military might to stamp out what they see as divergent and traditional cultures that contain their awakened enemies. It's important to highlight the Union's complicity with the evils of colonialism at this point, but I think it's a fitting analogy. Both want control, and although they tout their good intentions, will gain that control through force and exploit those that they have control over. That said, I think it would be more interesting to get a look at the other technomancers of the time. Although it's easy to look at the wonders of the Industrial Revolution, other factions more similar to the Order of Reason still exist around the world, and I would have liked to have known if they were crushed as traditionalists by the Union or partnered with them. The modern section of the history is what you would expect, and gives a small background to the conventions and a summary of the Union's modern history, nearly ending with their apparent victory over the traditions in the current era, then subverting the Union's own self-congratulation by pointing out the looming apocalypse and the corruption and cracks beginning to erode the ivory tower. For me, I found it easy to look back at some of this history and wish for more, but hindsight is 2020, and I enjoyed it a lot for what it is. I think giving some background to the modern Union as formerly utopian idealists is wonderful. Chapter 4 goes into much greater depth about the structure of the modern Union and how it all works, listing ranks, organisations, and how the Union goes about their everyday today of world domination. My favourite part of this is where they list the standard protocols for dealing with the other splats, as in the other games made by World of Darkness, as it gives an interesting use for Technocrats in games outside of Mage. My favourite by far is the vampires, who they seem to hardly understand and consider basically to be polite and quiet neighbours. I can't help feeling that if the Union took the time to uncover the vast control over human society the Camarilla and even the Sabbat possess, they would be far less laissez-faire in their attitude towards them. This section also mentions the technocratic colonies in space and its space fleet, something personally I choose to totally ignore. I have very little interest in this fantasy in the World of Darkness game. The Dreaming and the Umbra, although fantastical, are reflections of the real world and interesting because of this, but outer space for me has very few links to the largest appeal of the World of Darkness for me, that is that it's set in the real world and grounded in it. Chapter 5 is a more detailed look at the conventions, the societies that make up the Union, each with their own purviews and specialties. Iteration X are the crafters of the Union, in charge of creating and maintaining their technological advantage. Their most infamous creations are the biomechanical constructs, blending of man and machine, from the innocuous GPS chip to the hit-mark combat androids, the World of Darkness' very own Terminators. Most of the fluff here focuses on the dehumanizing effect of the convention's creations and how they deal with it, or don't. It's also stated the convention is secretly run by an all-powerful artificial intelligence. Personally, I'm just not a fan of this idea, and I think it takes away much of the group's agency. But ultimately, this is the kind of background info that I can not see being used in many games. It also talks about the artisans, the iteration's predecessors, something I always like to see, as the artificers, alongside the craft masons, are some of the most interesting of the pre-Technocracy technomages, and although some of the history is a little fuzzy in my opinion. The cherry here, however, is the description of Bryce Leathernad's Hill, the Iterator's most famous slayer of reality deviants, who was last seen fighting the infamous Paradox Spirit, Old Man Wrinkle, with a minigun. Next are the most iconic of the Technocrats conventions, the New World Order. These guys are the stereotypes of the cool-headed black suit, Matrix agents and James Bond rolled into one. They're the successors to the Cabal of Pure Thought, who they subsumed with the newly formed Union deemed them too religious. The Orisons are also dogged by conspiracy theories, appropriately, saying they have an older origin linked with the Illuminati or the Knights Templar. This is the Knights Templar before they were formed as their own craft in the background, and has more to do with the Da Vinci Code version than the Awakened Warriors of Christ. The New World Order are both the most human of the conventions and the most sinister. If a New World Order agent really wants you gone, they may not zap you with a Void Engineer's laser gun or set a hit mark on you, but they can erase you from existence, removing all references to you from databases, mind-wiping your friends and family to forget you, or even replacing you with a clone with some progenitor help. They are ultimate enforcers of the consensus, and they decide what the consensus is. I really like their tools and instruments, as the idea of challenging magic through power ties, flashing a badge, and other social guises is very creative. These guys are currently in charge of the traditions, more or less, only rivaled by the Syndicate, who we'll look at shortly. Before that, however, we have the progenitors, the Frankenstein biologists. To those wishing to judge the Union based on morality, the progenitors possess the best and worst of the technocracy. The same lab that may create human clones, engineer plagues and biological nerve agents may also be working on cures for cancer and other terminal diseases. While not as monstrous as, say, Pentech's R&D, they nevertheless create sentient and non-sentient beings that cannot survive outside the real world in their labs. And their paradox backslashes are things of nightmares. Think Ripley clones in Aliens Resurrection. They are one of the less field-active conventions, preferring to stay within their labs, but they are indispensable to the Union for what they create there. After the progenitors are the Syndicate. I must admit a bias here, as I love the Syndicate as one of my favourite factions in all of the World of Darkness. In Dark Ages, I much prefer the Craft Masons and dislike their predecessors, the High Guild. But as the tone of the game changes to the modern Knights, the Syndicate come to the fore for me. They are everything wrong with the Union, possessing very few idealists or anything like a noble cause. They exist entirely for the bottom line. While this section is a cool look at the convention, they don't have their signature sphere, that of primal utility, by this book. And the Syndicate convention book really adds a whole lot to them. So I recommend, if you want to know more, reading that for their full awesomeness, as the cynical and pragmatic Syndicate really starts to happen in that book. But here they are given a good overview as the shady finances of the Technocracy. Their real appeal for me, however, is the sheer creativity of their paradigm and practices, possessing almost no ability for vulgar magic. They blur the line between real-world influences and magic in a way that really appeals to me. They're also the second most influential of the Union's conventions, being the bank that allows the other conventions their labs and projects. No Syndicate, no robot armies or cloning labs, and they are quick to remind the other conventions of this. The Syndicate are awesome, and although that shows it here, it's not until later they really get their funnest tools to allow them to become the monsters of finance, influence and backroom dealings. Lastly, we have the Void Engineers. This convention was for a long time by far my least liked, simply because I don't see how Space Marines and deep space exploration fitted into a World of Darkness game, and how it blends with the rest of the lore. This book even makes that point, saying that the Void Engineers have difficulty dealing with and relating to the other conventions, isolated as they are by their field of specialty. This disconnection, combined with the fact they are presented as the friendly convention, who might have a cheeky pint with a member of a society of ether given the opportunity, and who, and I quote, think the traditions are not bad sort, made me for a long time see them as boring and without an edge or really a point. However, recently, a few friends of mine turned me around on this. The idea was put forward to me in two different ways. First one being that of the idea of the Void Engineer's primary job not being void exploration, but the enforcement of the Gauntlet and tackling supernatural breaches head on, making them more of a Ghostbusters or Stargate SG-1 than Star Trek. For me, this gives them a much stronger purpose within the Union, and it is actually mentioned in this book and others, but tragically always as a side purpose of the convention. The other concept that changed my mind was the idea of the convention taking the idea of exploration of the unknown to a conceptual level. With this, they become experts not only in umbral realms and dimensions, but also other reality deviants, embracing knowledge the other conventions would find distasteful. This way of looking at the conventions takes them away from space travel as their main purpose, and frankly unfitting ideas about spaceships and space stations, and sticks them right back in the grit of the World of Darkness, monitoring other supernaturals, closing gauntlet portals, and combating the unknown horrors of this world of darkness, not the worlds removed from it. Chapter 7 is character recruitment and gives details on how to make your own Technocratic PC. As much as the rest of the book has added nuance to the Union as a whole, this section gives you the ability to add uniqueness to your own character. Despite tradition stereotype, Technocrats are still awakened beings with all the unique and amazing things that come with that. There are interesting explanations of Technocratic versions of regular stats and abilities, and several newly added ones specifically for the Technocratic Union, such as requisitions or certain Technocratic abilities, as well as particular merits or flaws that allow you to even play hitmark killing machines, if that is your thing. I especially like the sections that talk about Technocratic avatars, really showing there is an awakened genius behind Union agents, not just robotic monotony. The end of this section gives several ideas for pre-made characters, ranging from a kindly looking grandpa explorer all the way to Control, who looks like a fantasy game gnome. Several of the example characters are not awakened, hinting at the Union's use of unawakened citizens. After that, we have the storytelling section. This section gives details on the many and varied possibilities for Union-based games, justifications for amalgams, plot hooks, and many other excellent tools for the storyteller looking to explore the world of the Technocrats. Even more than the hierarchical traditions, a Union game allows from a very top-down approach, but this section encourages you not to use the Technocratic higher-ups as simple NPC quest givers, but to use them to hint at the Union's corruption and infighting. So a game that starts as an investigation into reality deviants may in fact have the players acting as tools in a cover-up, with them uncovering a deeper conspiracy that was hinted at. I feel that Union games can lend themselves very well to intrigue, having the sometimes all too recognisable Union give way to conspiracy and backstabbing. Alternatively, you could play it straighter and have your players hunt mages or vampires, flipping the usual dynamic of trying to remain hidden from the powers that be to being the ones doing the hunting. The possibility with Technocrat games are just as varied as tradition games and lend themselves to inspiration from cop films, murder mysteries, and social sci-fi like Minority Report, X-Files, or Blade Runner. It also gives good advice on how to keep a player group together, the unseen downfall of many an RPG group. But the task is not too difficult in a Union game. As a Technocracy, technically you all work for the same boss. This section also offers some ideas for alternate history settings, maybe with different conventions like the virtual adepts still in the Union, or a historical draw along the Silk Road from ancient China with the merchant caravan. The limits for playing a Union game really are endless, and this section gives that great credence. The last section before the appendix gives examples of Technocratic ropes called procedures, devices and wonders, as well as some crazy enhancements such as bionics and biomods. Everything from pheromone release glands to implanted plasma cannons. These devices and wonders are interesting, but about what you would expect. For the most part, they're like James Bond style hidden gadgets, but do offer progenitor battle homunculus similar to Sumise Vosge and space capable battle armor if you wanted to put the adapters Astartes into your Void Engineer Space Marine. The appendix offers a short list of suggested readings for inspiration when running Union games, and is also about what you might expect, and still easily holds up even after 20 years since the book was written. Overall, the Guide to Technocracy not only offers a look at a faction for Mage the Ascension with a unique and interesting paradigm and style, but also opens the book on games' most iconic villains, giving them a depth and character they had not previously had. After this book was published, the convention books for all of the Union conventions were also released, as well as them being fully incorporated into the core Mage experience in M20, now having an even deeper background to draw on, but still holding true to the style and stereotypes that made them interesting and terrifying in the first place. I do hope you enjoyed my look at this older White World source book and my discussions on the background found in it. The Union really are a fascinating faction, and I hope to look at more in the future with other videos if this one is well received. But if I do make more videos, and I enjoyed making this one a lot, I hope not just to look at Mage, but also Vampire, Werewolf and other aspects of the World of Darkness, as well as game mechanics. If you have your own suggestions, please let me know, and I'll see if it appeals to me and if I can get hold of the book. Thank you very much for listening, and this was the Hermetic Hipster.